On the 14th of April, 1973, a concrete wall 67 feet long slid off the upstream face of a dam in central Louisiana and vanished into brown water. Nobody saw it go. The river was carrying so much sediment that visibility below the surface was essentially zero, and the noise of a flood at full volume covers almost everything. The crews on site knew because the wall stopped being where it had been. That wall was the least of it. When engineers started running soundings around the structure, the readings came back wrong in a way that took a while to accept. Under the concrete slab, in the place where the foundation was supposed to be resting on solid material, there was a hole. Roughly the footprint of a football field. More than 50 feet deep. It had been dug out by the river itself, working underneath the dam like water under a poorly set fence post, and it had undermined 7 of the 11 gate bays. Downstream of the structure, a second hole of similar size had opened. According to accounts of the emergency, the 2 scour holes came within about 150 feet of each other. If they had joined, the dam would have had nothing left to stand on. For weeks, barges dropped stone into the water more or less continuously, buying time by the hour while the crest passed. The structure held. It was never the same again, and by most accounts it has since been limited to something closer to 60% of the flow it was built to pass. The other half of the emergency was a decision made under time pressure by the general commanding the Corps Division at the time, Charles Noble, who authorized opening a floodway downstream on very short notice to pull water off the river and take load off the structure. That's a decision with a cost attached, and everybody making it knew the cost. Opening a floodway means deliberately putting water on land where people live and farm, in order to keep it off land where more people live and farm. Nobody involved in flood control on the lower Mississippi gets to make a clean choice. They get to pick which parishes take the water. The thing that nearly went that spring is called the Old River Control Structure, and it sits in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, about 220 river miles above New Orleans, in a stretch of country where you can drive for half an hour without passing a gas station. It is not famous. It has no observation deck worth the name. And it is the single reason that the Mississippi River still runs past Baton Rouge and New Orleans at all. That is the thing the Delta is hiding. Not a lost city, not a legend. A gated concrete complex in a farming parish holding a continental river in a channel the river has been trying to leave for the better part of a century. Before going further, there's a piece of vocabulary that trips up almost every conversation about this. When Americans say the Mississippi Delta, most of them mean the flat cotton country in northwest Mississippi. Between the Yazoo River and the Mississippi, the region that gave the world Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters, and the entire architecture of the blues. That place is an alluvial floodplain built by the river spilling over its banks across thousands of years. It's magnificent, and it's historically enormous, and geologically speaking, it is not a delta. The actual delta is in Louisiana. It's the fan of Marsh Bay Ridge and open water where the river finally puts down its load and meets the Gulf, roughly from the Atchafalaya Basin east to the Chandeleur Islands, and it covers a good chunk of the southern third of the state. That's the delta this story is about. Everything that follows happens on the Louisiana side of the line, in mud that is mostly younger than the pyramids. And here's the part that takes some getting used to. That delta was never supposed to be permanent. Not a single acre of it. A river reaching a coastal plain has one basic job at the end of its run: to get water and sediment to the sea by the shortest available downhill path. As it does that, it builds. Sediment drops out where the current slows, the channel extends itself seaward, and the river's own success starts working against it. Each mile of new land is another mile the water has to travel on a slope that keeps getting flatter. The channel silts up. The gradient goes slack. Eventually, during some big flood, the river breaks through its bank somewhere upstream and finds a route to the Gulf that is shorter and steeper, and it takes it. The old channel is abandoned to slow decay, and a new lobe of delta starts building somewhere else along the coast. Geologists call this avulsion, which is a clinical word for a violent event. The Mississippi has done it repeatedly. Over roughly the last 7,000 years, the river has built and walked away from a series of major delta lobes across coastal Louisiana. Researchers argue about the exact boundaries and dates, and the chronology has been revised more than once, but the broad sequence is well established. A lobe to the west, near what's now Vermilion Bay, then the Teche lobe, then the St. Bernard lobe, pushing east toward the Chandeleurs, then La Fourche running southwest through what's now Bayou La Fourche, and finally the modern Birdfoot below New Orleans, the shape everybody recognizes from satellite images. Each lobe held for something on the order of 1,000 years or more. Each one was abandoned. You can still read the old ones on a map without any training. Every one of those long, thin, oddly straight ridges running through the marsh, the ones with a 2-lane highway and a line of houses on top, is a natural levee built by a river channel that no longer exists. Bayou La Fourche was the Mississippi. Bayou Teche was the Mississippi. The high ground people build on in South Louisiana is almost entirely the leftovers of dead river courses. It's a landscape assembled from the river's previous decisions. So when we say the delta exists, what we mean is that the current lobe is the one that happens to be active right now. The Birdfoot below New Orleans is the youngest of them. By the ordinary schedule of this coast, it is somewhere in the late portion of its life. Under natural conditions, the river would already be somewhere else, and honestly, it would have been somewhere else for decades. Which brings up the obvious question. If the river wants to leave, where does it want to go? About 315 river miles above the mouth, the Mississippi passes a junction where the Red River comes in from the northwest, and where another river, the Atchafalaya, heads off to the southwest. The Atchafalaya is not a tributary. It's a distributary, a channel that carries water away from the main river toward the Gulf on its own route through the swamps of south-central Louisiana. Compare the two paths, and there's no contest. From that junction, the Mississippi's route to the Gulf runs roughly 300 river miles, wandering southeast past Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and then out through the Birdfoot, where the channel has extended so far into deep water that it's essentially a jetty of mud sticking off the edge of the continental shelf. The Atchafalaya's route to the Gulf, from the same starting point, is roughly 150 miles shorter, and it drops over that distance with more than twice the slope. Depending on stage, the Atchafalaya's bed at the junction sits something like 17 to 19 feet lower than the Mississippi's. Put a drop of water at that junction and ask it which way it would rather go, and the physics answers immediately. Steeper is faster. Faster carries more. More carrying capacity means the channel scours deeper, and a deeper channel captures more of the flow, which makes it scour deeper still. It's the most classic runaway feedback loop in river science, and once it gets going past a certain point, nothing stops it. It's the same reason water in your yard eventually finds one channel across the driveway instead of spreading politely. The steepest path wins, and then it wins harder. The Atchafalaya got its chance because of us, more or less by accident. In 1831, a steamboat captain named Henry Shreve cut a channel across a big loop of the Mississippi called Turnbull's Bend to save boats a few miles of travel. The severed loop silted in at its upper end, and what remained of it became known, with perfect flatness, as Old River. Then, in 1839, crews cleared an enormous logjam that had been plugging the Atchafalaya for generations. Pulling that raft out was like pulling a plug in a bathtub. The Red River's flow, and then a growing share of the Mississippi's, began running down the newly opened path. The numbers tell the story cleanly. Around 1900, something like 12% of the combined flow at that latitude was going down the Atchafalaya. By the late 1940s and early 50s, that share had climbed past 30% and was still climbing, and the Atchafalaya's channel was visibly enlarging year over year, exactly as the feedback loop predicts. In 1950, two engineers with the Mississippi River Commission, Latimer and Schweizer, surveyed the situation and put their conclusion on paper. Extrapolating the trend, they projected the Atchafalaya would be taking something like 43% of the flow by 1965, and that once it passed roughly 40%, the capture would accelerate beyond any practical ability to reverse it. Harold Fiske, the geologist whose maps of the Mississippi's old channels are still reproduced as artwork, reached compatible conclusions in his own study for the Corps. The professional judgment converged fast. The river was in the early stage of an avulsion, on a clock measured in decades. What made this a national problem rather than a regional curiosity is what had been built along the doomed channel in the meantime. By 1950, the lower Mississippi between Baton Rouge and the Gulf was one of the most heavily capitalized industrial corridors on the planet. Deepwater ports, refineries, grain terminals, chemical plants, cities, and the entire drainage and navigation logic of the American interior all assumed that a large river would keep flowing past their front doors indefinitely. If the Mississippi jumped to the Atchafalaya, the old channel wouldn't dry up exactly. It would become a long, salty tidal estuary connected to the Gulf, shoaling and shallow, with the Gulf pushing seawater far inland. The freshwater intakes would be sucking brine. The ports would be looking at dredging bills nobody wanted to imagine, permanently. Meanwhile, the water and the sediment would be arriving somewhere else entirely, in a basin with a fraction of the levees and none of the infrastructure. Congress responded in the Flood Control Act of 1954. The authorization did something rivers don't usually experience. It set a numerical target for how a river was allowed to divide itself. The Corps of Engineers was directed to maintain the flow distribution at roughly the proportions that existed in 1950, about 70% staying in the Mississippi and about 30% going down the Atchafalaya, measured as an annual average of the latest flow, meaning the combined flow of the Mississippi and the red above the control point. I find that a strange piece of legislative writing, and I mean that admiringly. A law froze a percentage and then required an agency to defend it against gravity. Every engineering decision at that site for the last 70 years has essentially been an attempt to keep a physical system obedient to a number chosen in the middle of the 20th century by men who picked it because it described the situation they happened to inherit. Why 30% and not 0? Because by then, the Atchafalaya wasn't optional. Its channel had already grown to depend on that water. The Red River drained into it, and the Atchafalaya Basin had been designated as the primary escape route for the biggest floods, the pressure relief valve that keeps New Orleans from receiving a flood the levees can't hold. Cutting the Atchafalaya off would have solved the avulsion problem by creating a worse one. The 70-30 split was a compromise with an ongoing physical process, and everyone involved understood it that way. The structures went up through the late 50s and were finished in 1963. Old River, the leftover loop, was dammed. In its place, the Corps built a low sill control structure, 566 feet long with 11 gate bays, sitting in an inflow channel dug between the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya's headwaters, plus an overbank structure designed to pass water only during high stages. Every drop crossing between the two rivers would now cross under a gate that somebody decided to raise. 10 years later came 1973. That flood was long, rather than merely tall, which is the dangerous combination for a foundation. The water stayed up for months. The head difference across the low sill, the difference in water level between the Mississippi side and the Atchafalaya side, drove flow through the gates at velocities the design had contemplated, but not for that duration. And beneath the concrete, in the fine sands and silts of an alluvial plain, the river found a route. Water going under a structure instead of through it removes support grain by grain, and it does this invisibly. By the time the wing wall failed in April, the excavation underneath was already enormous. The floodway that got open that spring is the Morganza control structure, downstream of Old River, authorized back in the Flood Control Act of 1936 and built with 125 gated bays along the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin. It's the pressure relief valve for the entire lower river, and the record of its use tells you how rare a genuine emergency is on this system. It has been opened 3 times since it was finished, in 1973, in 2011, and in 2019. In 2011, 17 bays were eventually opened, sending on the order of 114,000 cubic feet per second into the basin and across land that had to be evacuated first. Once the water dropped in 1973, the repair work began. Grouting to fill the void under the slab, riprap to armor the scour holes, and a long reckoning with the fact that the design margin had been considerably thinner than anyone believed. The response was to stop asking the low sill to do the job alone. In 1986, the Corps completed the Old River Control Auxiliary Structure, a second larger gated structure a short distance away, specifically built to carry a large share of the diversion, so the damaged low sill wouldn't have to. Then in 1990, a private hydroelectric plant came online in the same complex, the Sidney A. Murray Jr. Station, about 192 megawatts running through bulb turbines. The plant is clever from an operational standpoint. It passes water that has to cross to the Atchafalaya anyway, and takes the energy out of it on the way. Water that would otherwise be spending its power tearing at concrete spends it turning generators instead. Add the navigation lock that lets barges move between the 2 rivers, and the complex has 4 ways to move water and 1 way to move boats. Day to day, operating it is a continuous arithmetic problem. Gauge readings come in, flows get computed, and gates get adjusted to hold that annual average near 30% while managing the head difference across the structures, the sediment moving through, and the scour risk at every opening. In a low water year, the operators are trying to send enough. In a high water year, they're trying not to send too much, at velocities that erode. The 70-30 split isn't a setting you dial in and leave. It's a target you chase all year, forever. And it works. That's the part that deserves saying plainly. For more than 60 years, a system that was in the middle of abandoning its own delta has been held in place by a handful of gates in a rural parish, and the ports downstream have never had a single day where the river simply wasn't there. Holding it, though, has a price, and the bill comes due about 200 miles south of the gates, out in the marsh. A delta stays above water only if it keeps receiving sediment. Deltaic soil is mostly compressible mud and organic matter, and it settles under its own weight from the moment it's deposited. That settling, plus regional geological subsidence, plus rising sea level, means the surface is always sinking relative to the water. In a natural delta, the sinking is offset by deposition. The river floods, spills across the marsh, drops a fresh layer, and the ledger balances or comes out slightly ahead. That's how the land got there in the first place. Levee the river, and you break that arrangement completely. Flood control works by preventing exactly the overbank flooding that used to feed the marsh. The sediment stays in the channel and gets carried out past the Birdfoot, where it drops off the edge of the continental shelf into deep water and is gone from the coastal system permanently. So the marsh keeps sinking and stops being resupplied. On top of that, there's less sediment to work with than there used to be. Suspended sediment loads in the lower Mississippi have fallen by roughly half since the middle of the 20th century, largely because of the enormous number of dams built across the basin, especially the big Missouri River dams closed in the early 1950s. Every reservoir upstream is a settling basin. The river reaching Louisiana today is measurably clearer than the one that built the delta. The result has been measured carefully, and the number is difficult to look at. The United States Geological Survey, in an analysis led by Brady Cavillion published in 2017, found that coastal Louisiana lost about 2,006 square miles of land between 1932 and 2016, with a margin of error of about 170 square miles. That's roughly a quarter of the land area that existed in 1932. It's an area comparable to the state of Delaware, converted from marsh into open water inside a single human lifetime. The rate matters as much as the total. Loss peaked in the 1970s at around 32 square miles per year and has slowed since, running closer to 11 square miles per year in recent decades. The USGS team offered a comparison that has stuck. At the peak rate, Louisiana was losing a football field of wetland roughly every 34 minutes. At more recent rates, roughly every 100 minutes, slower, still relentless. It's worth being precise about causes, because this gets oversimplified constantly. Researchers attribute the losses to several mechanisms in combination. Levees cutting off sediment delivery, and the extraction of oil, gas, and water from beneath the marsh, which accelerates subsidence, each account for a large share. Upstream dams reducing sediment supply account for a smaller portion, maybe a fifth by some estimates. Add canals dredged for navigation and oil access, which let salt water into freshwater marsh and kill the vegetation holding the soil together, and storms that strip weakened marsh in a single afternoon. Old River is one input into that system, and by itself, it explains only part of the loss. But it's the input that decides where the river's remaining sediment gets delivered, and right now the answer is past everything that needs it, into water 2,000 feet deep. So why keep doing it? Because of what's built on the current channel, and the inventory is genuinely staggering. Start with the port complex. The Port of South Louisiana stretches along 54 miles of the lower river between New Orleans and Baton Rouge and is the largest tonnage port in the United States and in the Western Hemisphere. In 2024, it handled more than 250 million short tons of cargo. Along that same corridor sit 4 major refineries with a combined capacity around 1.4 million barrels a day, 10 oil storage terminals holding something over 200 million barrels, and 11 petrochemical plants. A very large share of American grain exports leaves the country through this stretch of water, moving downriver by barge, from farms 1,000 miles north. Every bit of that depends on one condition: a deep, fresh, navigable river in that channel. It depends on it the way a city depends on its water main. And there's no quiet substitute waiting in the wings. A single covered hopper barge carries what it takes many truckloads to move, and a tow pushing dozens of them replaces a train that doesn't exist and a highway convoy nobody would want to share a road with. That arithmetic is why grain from Iowa and Illinois goes south by water instead of east by rail. Take the river out of that equation, and you don't reroute the freight. You reprice it for every farm in the basin and every buyer overseas. The other side of the junction has stakes too, and they get left out of this conversation almost every time. An avulsion wouldn't be a river discovering empty wilderness. The Atchafalaya Basin has towns, highways, pipeline crossings, a working port at Morgan City, and levees sized for a floodway, not for a permanent continental river. Sending the Mississippi down that path would mean rebuilding the flood protection of an entire region around a channel that had suddenly tripled in size, while the old one turned brackish. There is no version of this where somebody simply lets nature take its course and everything is fine. And you don't need a full avulsion for the dependency to show. You just need a dry year, which is what happened in 2022, 2023, and 2024. Salt water is denser than fresh. When the river's discharge drops far enough, its downstream push weakens, and Gulf water slides upstream along the bottom of the channel as a wedge, with fresh water riding over the top. The wedge doesn't announce itself at the surface. It arrives underneath, and it arrives at exactly the depth where municipal intake pipes sit. In 2022, and then again more severely in 2023, the wedge moved far enough up the river to threaten drinking water supplies in Plaquemines Parish and to raise real questions about intakes serving the New Orleans area. The Corps of Engineers responded by building an underwater sill across the riverbed near River Mile 64, close to Myrtle Grove, essentially a submerged levee of dredged material meant to block the dense salt layer while letting fresh water spill over the top. Construction on the 2023 sill began in July of that year, initially built to an elevation of 55 feet below the surface, and later raised as conditions worsened. Residents in the lower parish spent months on bottled water, and salt corrosion did real damage to plumbing and appliances. The wedge didn't fully retreat until January of 2024, and the situation repeated the following year. Think about what that sequence tells you. In a low-water year, on a river that is currently receiving about 70% of the available flow by federal mandate, the Gulf still comes far enough upstream to contaminate municipal water. That's the margin we're operating on. Now imagine the same drought on a channel receiving substantially less, which is where the engineering conversation stands today, and it has gotten harder over the last few years, not easier. For about 20 years, the leading answer to Louisiana's land loss was to punch controlled holes in the levee and let the river build marsh again on purpose. The flagship version was the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion, a large gated channel through the West Bank levee in Plaquemines Parish, designed to send a big pulse of sediment-laden water into Barataria Basin during high river periods and rebuild wetlands the way the river used to. It was the centerpiece of the state's coastal master plan, funded largely with Deepwater Horizon settlement money, authorized at a budget above $2 billion. Ground was broken in August of 2023. It did not survive. Costs climbed, litigation multiplied, coastal fishing communities fought it hard on the grounds that a large freshwater pulse would wreck oyster grounds and push dolphins and brown shrimp out of the basin. And a federal permit was suspended. In July of 2025, the state's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and the Louisiana Trustee Implementation Group formally agreed to terminate the project. The authorized budget was written down to roughly $619 million, reflecting money already spent, with the remainder redirected toward other restoration work. Louisiana's stated replacement is a smaller diversion at Myrtle Grove, paired with dedicated dredging, alongside a broader shift toward building marsh mechanically, pumping dredged sediment through pipelines to construct land where the state wants it, on a schedule, without depending on the river's behavior or its politics. That approach has real successes behind it, including projects that have built thousands of acres of new marsh and ridge. It also costs money every single time, and it does not create a self-sustaining system. Mechanical marsh creation is a subscription, and the natural process it replaces used to be free. Meanwhile, back at the junction, the Corps has been doing something it hadn't done in decades. In August of 2023, it awarded a contract of roughly $34 million for a steel dewatering system that would let crews drain the low-sill structure and stand on its foundation, scheduled for the low water season of 2024. It was the first dewatering of that structure since the repairs and modifications of 1987. The purpose was straightforward: put engineers and instruments directly onto submerged concrete and foundation material that has been carrying a nearly 40-year-old set of modifications, and test it by hand instead of by inference. The Corps has continued publishing monitoring and performance work on the structure since. That's the current state of the balance. On one side, the state has stepped back from letting the river rebuild its own delta and committed instead to building land by machine. On the other, the agency holding the river in place has gone down into the dry to check its own oldest assumption. Both of those decisions were made in the last 3 years. Both of them are still playing out in budget cycles and inspection reports, rather than in anything dramatic enough to make the evening news. The argument at Old River is not settled and was never going to be. It's being relitigated right now quietly by people with survey instruments and appropriations documents, and the outcome will decide what South Louisiana looks like for everyone born there this decade. There's one thing I'd like to ask, and I'm curious about the answers. Everybody who grew up near moving water has one piece of infrastructure they took completely for granted until they learned what it was doing. A flood wall, a pump station, a dam nobody talks about. Tell me yours in the comments and where it is. Because the reason a structure like the one at Old River stays invisible is that it works. And the day it stops working is a terrible time to learn its name. And if this earned it, drop a like on the way out and subscribe so the next one finds you instead of the other way around.